I'm Wade McMullen, Senior Vice President for Programs and Legal Strategy here at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and really excited to welcome all of you, our board, our leadership council, our staff, to this really great discussion between Sushma Raman and Zach Norris today concerning Zach Norris's book, We Keep Us Safe. This is the second iteration of our RFK book club, and huge thanks to Nisa Patel from RFK Human Rights, who has organized these, sent out the books, coordinated the speakers, gotten everybody on this call today. Wouldn't have happened, any of it, without her efforts. So huge thanks to Nisa for gathering us and really spearheading this initiative that we're excited to see the results of thus far during our kind of shelter in place and work from home during COVID, but hope to continue in the new year as well. Following on the previous discussion, we're really excited to have Sushma and Zach with us today to talk about issues that are not only extremely relevant to the news cycle and all of our lives, but to the work that we're doing right here at RFK Human Rights. So our closest supporters, friends and family on this call know very well that over the last 5 years, we've continued our commitment to that is inspired by the life and the work of Robert Kennedy. And as a part of that, we've taken our efforts and our resources to invest right here in the United States in issues of racial justice, issues concerning the epidemic of mass incarceration in this country and the legacy of economic and racial exploitation that underpins those systems. And this year alone, we've partnered with over 36 groups around the country to help free people from unjust pretrial incarceration, partnering with Colin Kaepernick and his Know Your Rights camp to support local organizers, local bail funds who are trying to build power in their own community to keep their community safe from the harms of over-policing, the harms of mass incarceration, and to free their community members, to integrate them back into a society, into a community that can ensure their well-being far more so than our criminal legal system can, and to begin to repair the harms that are being exacted upon them through our criminal legal system, in particular its exploitative, racially unjust history. This conversation today, I couldn't imagine two better people to have this conversation together, to invite us into the conversation, to really explore the nuances of what we're talking about in this moment and how we can approach issues of racial justice with respect to policing, incarceration, and surveillance, and these systems that for far too long our community, even our philanthropic sector and our nation have just taken for granted as methods that are necessary to keep our society safe and whole. When you start to look under the hood just a little bit, you realize that these are systems that were never designed to keep communities safe. But that is the narrative, the dominant narrative in our society. And I'm really excited to unpack that more today with experts to help lead that conversation. So all of you obviously know Zach Norris because you've read his book and you've received it, but just by way of introduction, Zach is the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, the author of We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities. Zach is also the co-founder of Restore Oakland, a community advocacy and training center that will empower Bay Area community members to transform local economic and justice systems and make a safe and secure future possible for themselves and their families. And was also a co-founder of Justice for Families, a national alliance for family-driven organizations working to end our nation's youth incarceration epidemic, among many other accomplishments in his life. And we're so glad to have him with us today. And no better person that's a part of the RFK family than Sushma to help moderate and lead this discussion with Zach about his book and these important ideas. Sushma is a longtime member of the RFK family, starting off as a judge of the RFK Human Rights Award for years. And most recently, in her new capacity, serving on our board of directors. In all of her day job, she's also the executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard. And she brings over 2 decades of global experience, launching, scaling, leading social justice and philanthropic programs and collaboratives, building capabilities of grassroots human rights organizations and their leaders, and teaching graduate courses in the public policy schools at UCLA, USC, Harvard, in the Harvard Kennedy School, where she now works. And we're so glad to have Sushma. Sushma has been leading some work right now through the Carr Center on restoring a human rights approach to human rights in the United States. And so often we relegate conversations about human rights in the United States to this like constrictive framework of civil rights and due process rights and procedural rights. And our hope now is to kind of break through that false facade and false framework, limiting framework, to really get to the root causes and a more holistic examination of how the criminal legal system, policing, jails, prisons, surveillance can be not only just a tool to tweak to have more just outcomes, but actually to be completely reimagined in the sense of how do we, if our ultimate goal is safety, our ultimate goal is human flourishing, if our ultimate goal is to reduce harm in our society writ large, then how does that help us view these systems that we tell ourselves every single day is doing that job, and what needs to change and how that change can come about. At RFK, our belief is that we enjoy tremendous privilege and power, and it's our job to redistribute those things in service and in partnership and in add value to the efforts of people who are on the front lines, communities who are directly impacted by these systems, and to come alongside them and to bring with us our power, our platform, our privilege, and to take on their demands as our own and to work together to reform these structures. Right now, going to leave it up to Sushma and Zach to lead us into this exploration of what is and what should be with respect to how we should think about these things, and what our role might be in helping bring that more just and peaceful world into existence. So I will turn it over to them now, and I'll be back to close this out at the end, and hopefully we'll have time for questions. So whether you want to put them into the chat as we go, Nisa and I can monitor those as we go. Sushma will see them, and Zach will see them as well. But we'll also have a time set aside if you want to kind of turn your camera on and ask the question directly at the end. So without further ado, please, Sushma and Zach, you take it away.
Thank you so much, Wade, for this very kind introduction, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. And thank you, Zach, for this amazing piece of work and your body of work over the years in protecting people and their rights. So it's really an honor and privilege for me to be here and to be engaged with RFK Human Rights. It's tragic that the US locks up more people per capita than any other nation. And a big problem that RFK Human Rights has tackled over the years is the issue of pretrial detention, the fact that so many people are locked up due to their inability to afford bail, cash bail. It's not that they're found guilty by a court, it's that they have not been able to afford bail while they are waiting for their case to go to trial. So the work that RFK Human Rights has done in this space has been really laudable in terms of supporting local bail funds, community organizations, advocacy to government officials, and really trying to educate people. And I think one important moment for me was when I heard Carrie Kennedy speak at an event that was hosted by the Carr Center, where she talked about whether we could imagine a different way. And she said, yes, it is possible. And she talked about communities, wealthy white communities, where people are always given second chances, where you can invest in young people, where you can give them a second chance, where you can call the parent instead of calling the police, where you can invest in mental health services, where you can invest in drug treatment programs. And it really struck me that, what we're really talking about is we're talking about people's lives, equality of opportunity and access from birth through youth and as an adult. And so I think it's in this context that I really value the work of RFK Human Rights and its approach in both working with people on the ground, as well as the advocacy policy work that happens at the kind of more macro level. That's really important for social change to happen. I hadn't read Zach's book prior to this, but I have a funny connection in that I attended his wedding because I have a connection to his wife, Saru Jayaraman,
Yeah,
who's a very impressive,
my biggest claim to fame.
amazing community organizer. So the book called We Keep Us Safe is really a very, very powerful framework for us to think about public safety in new ways, new innovative ways that really center the perspectives of people who have been harmed over the decades and centuries, and who we need to invest in more substantive ways. So I thought I would turn over to Zach now to share a few brief remarks, and then we'll have a conversation, and we'd love to hear from you, our audience, as well. Over to you, Zach.
Thanks, Sushma. I really appreciate that kind introduction, and it's great to be back in contact. It feels like, being with family, not just because of the wedding connection, but also just because of the connection between the Ella Baker Center and the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Center, and just the work that you all have been doing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the context of my opening remarks. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit about the Ella Baker Center, and also a little bit about this book that I wrote called We Keep Us Safe. So it's funny, Sushma, because that dynamic that you mentioned that Carrie spoke to around how wealthy communities are treated, and young people in particular within those communities, really is what led me to this work in some ways. So I grew up in East Oakland, was born in 1977, went to high school from 1991 to 1995. That was a time period in which the number of youth crime stories was going up by some 700%, even though youth crime in California was actually going down by 20%. So if you were seeing a youth crime story once per week in 1991, you were seeing it more like once per day by 1995, and that had a huge impact in terms of the number of youth prisons and institutions that were being built. And thankfully, I was sheltered from some of that as a light-skinned African-American kid who went to Catholic school from K through 12, ended up at Harvard University as an undergrad, and that's where I really saw just how differently young people were being treated, often for doing some of the same things. So if you were having a mental health episode or dealing with a drug problem at Harvard, you were given counseling and support and the time off, sort of worst case scenario, maybe a semester off to regroup and to come back and continue your studies. Meanwhile, I saw family and friends locked up for doing some of the same things. And that dynamic is what led me to an interest in this organization called the Ella Baker Center, which was putting out this framework of books not bars, and jobs not jails, and healthcare and housing not handcuffs, which resonated with me as a student, but also given my parents' experience. My father is an African-American former shipyard worker who was laid off after 18 years on the job. My freshman year in college, my mother transitioned from teaching in Catholic school to teaching in Oakland public schools that same first year at Harvard. And I just saw some of the struggles that they were facing and really wanted to connect with an organization that was advancing a human rights agenda, and also thinking about this trade-off between actually supporting people when they're down on their luck or they're going through a difficult time versus punishing, and really what I saw as making matters worse. So hearing about the Ella Baker Center was amazing as a law school student. That's how I first got involved. But the work of the Ella Baker Center really started when I was in high school. It was founded in 1996. In April of 1996, there was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle that described the death of Aaron Williams. And the San Francisco Chronicle said that Aaron Williams had died of something they called sudden in custody death syndrome. And if you're kind of scratching your head about what that could be, you're correct in that it's not actually a thing. Sudden in custody death syndrome was effectively something that they had made up and bought from the police department's rhetoric. They didn't mention that Aaron Williams was kicked and punched as he was hogtied in the back of a police van. They didn't mention that 3 cans of pepper spray were unloaded into his face. None of those facts. They didn't mention that Officer Mark Andaya, the lead officer on the scene, had a troubled history even as an Oakland Police Department officer, where he was booted out of that department before moving on to the San Francisco Police Department. And this was the mid 90s, so there wasn't this upswell of challenge around police violence that there is in this moment. But the Ella Baker Center and allies really lifted up this case in a way that allowed for people to see what really happened, for that narrative to come out, both in terms of what actually happened, but also about who Aaron Williams was, to dispel the portrayal of Aaron Williams that had been put out in the mainstream media before that. And as a result, Officer Mark Andaya was fired from the San Francisco Police Department, and some measure of justice was won as a result of grassroots organizing. Kerry Kennedy and others really lifted up the work of the Ella Baker Center and helped launch what was an initiative around police violence to really being something broader, to be able to encompass this vision of books, not bars, jobs, not jails, healthcare, and housing, not handcuffs. And I came aboard as a law school student, a recent graduate from law school. My first charge was to organize what would have been the largest, what ended up being the largest what ended up being the largest statewide network of families of incarcerated youth. We started with just a handful of families around a table who were dealing with having loved ones incarcerated, their children and grandchildren incarcerated in the state's California Youth Authority youth prison system. And these families were traveling like 250 miles on average just to see their kids. They were often arriving to be told that they couldn't visit their kids because they had on the wrong color pair of pants, or because their kids' entire unit was on lockdown. And so you can imagine the despair in terms of traveling hours upon hours, sometimes renting hotel rooms, only to be told when you got there that you couldn't even see your kid. Meanwhile, there were a slew of deaths inside of those youth prisons. So these were families who were not only dealing with not being able to see their kids, but also not knowing if the last time they had seen their kids would be the last. And so these families really said, we want to close down these youth prisons, which was a radical idea at the turn of the century. And we really got behind that idea as an organization, fought a near decade-long campaign to close 5 of 8 youth prisons in the state of California. And during that time period, youth crime continued to decline. So this was not only a win for human rights, but also a win for public safety. And that goes to Wade's point about the ways in which we think about our public safety systems and whether or not they're actually making us safe. And so I wrote this book really to examine some of those issues. What has been defined as crime? What are the harms that we see in our world writ large? And what's the difference between the two? Because one of the things, and I'll kind of close in my opening comments with these couple of reflections, one of the things that I think we just need to recognize is that the way in which we focused on crime tends to focus on crime in the streets rather than crime in the suites of power, crime on the corner rather than crime in the corner offices. We haven't really examined the way in which harms associated with climate change, with inequality, with a lack of a social safety net, continue to plague our society in ways that I think help to explain some seemingly contradictory phenomena. So for example, by and large, crime has been down over the last few decades, in particular the last couple decades, but our anxieties are at sky high, right? And that's partly because of this disconnect between the way in which our criminal court system focuses on a narrow set of harms rather than really addressing these larger harms. And I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if we take it seriously, really paints the way forward in terms of ensuring that all rights are respected and that we can be truly safe. So, one of the ways I define safety in the book is really talking about safety and security. So security really being those civil rights, right? That free from police abuse, that sort of civil rights framework is part of our security. But also safety is about our economic, social, and cultural rights. So if we don't have a roof over our heads, if we don't have food on our tables, then we also really can't consider ourselves truly safe. So I'm really just excited to be in dialogue with you, to be in this discussion with family about how we get to true safety. And I'll pause there and look forward to talking with you, Sushma, about some of these ideas.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Zach, for sharing your initial reflections. We'd welcome our audience to post questions in the chat so that we can draw on them. But let me get us started. You know, in your book, you talk about this framework of fear and this us versus them kind of mindset that we have, right? That is inculcated in all of us, whether through the media or just the ways in which people are raised, and the need for a shift from a fear-based way to a care-based way. So I'm wondering if you could talk about this framework of fear a little bit further and unpack what are the ways in which this care-based way would actually be actualized, if you will.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question. So the framework of fear really describes the way in which our criminal court system, but also our society writ large, has responded to a number of public health issues. And I talk about suspicion, surveillance, isolation, punishment as being sort of defining parts of this framework of fear. And I think that, you know, the easiest way to explain it is really to describe our current president. The 45th president of the United States is masterful as what I call an architect of anxiety. He stokes our fears and divisions and really obscures the real harms that are all around us that should be dealt with by government. And the book's title, "We Keep Us Safe," is really contrasting the what I call the "he keeps us safe" lie of would-be dictators. And that lie is an abusive lie. It is the lie that says, you know, don't trust your girlfriend, don't trust your mom, only trust me, even while that person is causing the abuse inside the home. And that framework can be applied to the nation state as well. It's like, don't trust your neighbor around the block, don't trust your neighbor in distant lands, don't trust your neighbor in the border. I will keep you safe, even as he is undermining democracy and not addressing harms associated with climate change and inequality. And so the culture of care and moving to a framework where we recognize that we keep us safe is really about recognizing that our safety is interdependent, that our safety is tied to one another. And I think 2020 has been an example of both the bad and the good in terms of that truism, right? Because we see that the most vulnerable communities, the folks who have been disinvested in this country over time, Black and Brown communities, LGBTQ communities, have been hardest hit by the phenomenon of COVID. We know that 2020 has also showed that Black folks in particular, subject to police violence at rates that few really wanted to deal with and grapple with in a real way. And so I think that there's an opportunity, though, also to see, and I see people recognizing our interdependence, the way in which this global pandemic really shows the way our public health and our safety is tied to one another. So I think that there is a real opportunity to move in a different direction as a result of that.
Thank you. So one of the things I really loved about your book was the stories that you have of people, regular people who have faced incredible adversity, and a combination of adversities that they face that intersect where they perhaps don't have the support systems or the resilience, then puts them in situations where they are perhaps unhoused or certain things occur, and you see this sort of chain of events. So I think
Yeah.
the book really humanizes the effects of policies on people, both in the current day as well as historically. And there was one story in particular that I actually had tears in my eyes when I read it. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to speak to this. On page 46, you talk about in the early 1800s, a young boy who was 7 years old was on an auction block in Richmond, Virginia, sold away from his mother, and that basically 1 in every 10 enslaved persons at that time was relocated from the states of the upper South to the lower South because of the need for more people to work to basically deal with the increased demand for the production of cotton. It's a really powerful story, and I'm reading this and I'm really, kind of compelled reading this and thinking about sort of this historical legacy that has led us to today. And then you talk about the fact that this boy, Joseph Norris, was your grandfather's grandfather. And that really kind of took my breath away, this sort of personal connection, if you will, through the centuries. And I'm wondering if you can speak to this. How did you know about this? How was this sort of relayed down to you? And how has that inspired the work that you've done both at Ella Baker Center and elsewhere?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question, Sushma. It's been relayed to me through my aunt and through her own sort of research, as well as connection to familial stories. And um, it it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. I have been listening to a book called Help Me Find My People recently, which describes folks' efforts to reconnect with their families. And as I've done that, I've been thinking about Joseph quite a lot, one of my ancestors, and just like, was that even the last family separation for him? I've read about folks who were separated as children and then later in life also separated as spouses, right? Read about, you know, harrowing tales of folks working to find their family. And if you know, read the book, like part of what I tried to do is say that these stories are not inevitable. And I lifted up on my own upbringing. I used to really love reading those choose your own adventure books. I don't know if people remember that, but it's like, if you think you should try to like swing across the vine and climb up the rope ladder, then turn to page 48. Or if you think you should dive into the water, turn to page 52. And so that inspired, reading those books kind of inspired me to think about, well, you know, there are tragic stories in our history. And more recently, I talk about the story of Alan Feaster and Darrell Feaster, who I knew Alan really personally. And he fought after his son died in the California Youth Authority youth prison system. He really fought and took up the charge of basically adopting all the other young people in that youth prison system and said, I'm going to fight till my last breath to fight to close down these youth prisons. And that's what he did. And I think that we should be really thinking about all of these intersection points. And that's what I do with both Alan and Darrell's life, is thinking about what it would look like if, instead of Darrell as a teenager being sent to a remote group home halfway across the state, he were actually, and his dad were invested in as a family and they were supported. What difference would that have made? And I hope that, you know, people can sort of connect that back to some of these seemingly abstract policies that we have in ways that I think don't really connect to the real people that impact them. I think you're, oh,
Sorry.
yeah,
So
no
something
worries.
else I really appreciated in your book is that as you move to the section where you talked about different ways to think about framing safety and security, you have, in addition to sort of the stories and information, you also have recommendations that you've developed that you are proposing on, you know, how to address many of the challenges that you've outlined as we think of this framework of fear. And I'm wondering if you could speak to some of these recommendations and, you know, and how did you arrive at this? Was this sort of based on your experience at the Ella Baker Center and the different organizations you've been part of? Is it based on sort of conversations with people who've been affected by these policies? So
Yeah,
these policies seem like very intuitive and very spot on, but they've also, it's obviously been very difficult to implement them, right? In terms
yeah,
of, in face of resistance, either from policymakers or the general public. So if
yeah.
you could help us think through this, it would be terrific. And for our audience, if you have questions, we'd love to hear from you. Do post your questions in the chat and we will definitely draw on them.
Yeah, I mean, I would start with a little bit of context to further define the framework of fear, because it isn't just, the architects of anxiety, the politicians who are intentionally, certain politicians who are intentionally dividing us. I think it's also the resource allocations and misallocations that we've made over the past 40 years slash 400 years. But, I was born in 1977, which is really the beginning, the late 70s, the beginning of the prison building boom here in California that spread across the nation. So we built 23 new prisons and just one new university from 1980 to 2000. 53 cents of every federal dollar goes to the military. The lion's share of city budgets go to policing, rather than a suite of human services. Um, and those resource allocations, policing and prisons have been shown to accelerate the morbidity and mortality of Black and brown people. And as Reverend Dr. William Barber says, that is not even really accounting for the sort of what he calls death measures on the down low. So while policing and prisons have been sort of recession proof over the past 30, 40 years, cuts to housing and education and healthcare have been systemic and systematic over that same time period. And so 700 people a day die from hunger. A certain number of people per year will die because they don't have access to healthcare. And so some of what is reflected in these recommendations is really trying to rebalance the way in which government spending has been geared over the past 40 years in ways that would respect the human rights of all individuals. And that's what I mean by 2020 being not sort of, people shouldn't see it as kind of an aberration or a crazy year. They should actually in some ways see it as a culmination of a lack of investment in public health solutions to public health issues, and a lack of addressing things that are not pandemics but are endemic to our society, like racism and patriarchy, and unfortunately inequality has been pretty endemic to US society as well. And so the recommendations in the book really reflect and are grounded in that understanding, but then I hope provide some common sense solutions that people can adhere to and find appealing. So I won't go through all of the recommendations. I want to just tell a story about one of them. In 2005, Richmond had one of the highest per capita murder rates in the country. Richmond, California, not Richmond, Virginia. And the city council was up in arms about what to do about that murder rate. Devone Bogan came to the city from the mentoring center program in Oakland and said, I want to create this mentorship program to actually support these young people who are believed to be responsible for the majority of homicides. And most people were pretty skeptical, but because the city had tried pretty much everything else, they had tried all the law enforcement driven approaches, they said, sure, we'll try it. And over, I think, an 8-year period, Devone Bogan, through this mentorship program, was able to reduce homicides by some 70–80% in the city of Richmond, which had a huge impact, not just on these young men, but also on the city as a whole, because now mothers and grandmothers could take their kids to the park, shopkeepers were keeping their businesses open longer. And the real defining feature of this program was that rather than looking at these predominantly young men as the problem, he began to engage, Devone Bogan engaged them as part of the solution, and said to them, look, this is what I have on offer. I'm going to provide you daily positive mentorship. I'm going to provide you a monthly stipend. I'm going to provide you travel opportunities. And he engaged them in a conversation about violence in the city and what could be done about it. And I think that story is a really good example of how we shift from a framework of fear, from a culture of suspecting, isolating people, to actually engaging them as participants in the solution and building out the seeds of a safer society as a result. So to me, that Richmond program is indicative of the shift that we need to the direction we need to take, but also just how underfunded it still is, because that program is funded at like $1 million a year versus the $60 million a year that the Richmond Police Department continues to receive. So I think it's an example of what can be done, but also the opportunity that we still have to really invest in solutions that will get us to greater safety.
Terrific. So we have a question from the audience, and I'll just summarize. If you have 2 minutes of someone's attention, how would you address their fears about interpersonal violence? And the context is that oftentimes people are stuck in terms of their fears in this area. And quote, they always ask, what about the violent people? Surely we have to lock those people up.
Yeah.
I'm hungry for new ways to help people get unstuck. So what are your thoughts about whether it's data or stories or information that could help people address such concerns?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question. So many great questions in the chat. I was just scrolling through a few of them. I think that the first thing to say is that, and I saw a question also about the abolition of prison, so I want to build that into this response. I think the first thing to say is, like, if we recognize that a harm is happening in our society, and that harm is really endemic to the way in which our society is governed, then we have to decide, how do we move away from that harm, and also acknowledge that it may not be an overnight switch. So I think a helpful analogy is the way in which we've come to see fossil fuels, right? So now fossil fuels, all of scientists and basically everyone except for climate deniers agree that, like, we need to move towards a more sustainable future. So they've decided to make investments, and we've decided to make investments in solar panels and wind turbines and all kinds of things, and to set targets towards moving in that direction. I think similarly, there's an opportunity to think not just of a new energy infrastructure, but also a new safety infrastructure. One of the reasons that we built Restore Oakland that Wade described is really to kind of visibilize what we think is kind of a solar panel for the community safety movement, to say that restorative justice, transformative justice, economic opportunity, people being able to stay in their homes, those are things that are fundamental to safety. So we wrapped all of those things into an 18,000 square foot building. It's in one of the most diverse areas within a very diverse city of Oakland. And we're building Restore Oakland as a vision for what community safety should look like in the future. And one of the things that we found and that vision came from the community. So we did a report called Who Pays the True Cost of Incarceration on Families, national community-driven research report done with Forward Together and 20 other community-based organizations. And people lifted up those same solutions as, these are the things that we believe make community safe. As we began to partner with folks to bring restorative justice to Restore Oakland, we found that this question of violence really came up. And our research shows that actually, contrary to kind of popular conception, cases involving violence can be some of the best candidates for a restorative and transformative approach. So we work with a group called Community Works that does restorative justice both in San Francisco and in Oakland. And they actually take more serious cases in San Francisco, cases involving violence. And what they found is that the recidivism rates for people who go through that restorative justice process in the more serious cases is actually even lower, meaning that people are less likely to get back involved in the system, right? Having gone through that restorative justice process. And part of the sort of hypothesis is that victims can really see that there's a clearer connection between the work that the person has done to amend the harm, to actually make amends to that person in these sort of clear cases of victimization. And so where victims agree to participate in the process, and this is a voluntary process on both parts, the restorative justice actually works even better in violent cases. And so that isn't to say that restorative justice works in all cases, but I think that we have vastly, vastly underfunded these solutions that have worked for eons and generations and have been used by indigenous communities the world over for so long and have been underinvested in our very punitive society. So that that combination of really describing, hey, this isn't an on or off switch, and here's how we can begin to build out the infrastructure to move in this different direction, I think has been helpful as I've tried to describe the shifts that we need to make in this country.
That's terrific. I noticed a question on reparations, and I actually worked on this a little bit for a class that I'm co-teaching this fall, and I learned so much. Actually, it's interesting that the movement for reparations has gained momentum in the last few months in the wake of protests over the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. But really, this has been something that has been present for decades, if not centuries, including during periods of enslavement. And there's really sort of several periods one needs to look at: the transatlantic slave trade and the periods when people were enslaved, but also, post-slavery, the period of Reconstruction, and where really people were terrorized, where people were lynched, where their lands were confiscated, where churches and schools and houses were burned. And Ray Winbush actually has found a link between lynching and confiscation of Black-owned lands, with Black landowners being the victims of lynching. And then, of course, in more recent decades, sort of the separate and segregated schools, neighborhoods, and differential sentencing, and so on. A great resource, academic resource on the issue of reparations is William Darity, who's at Duke. There are several people who work in the space, but he's actually sort of quantified as an economist what he believes needs to be a payment, which is $10 to $12 trillion, which is really to redress the racial wealth gap. Like, what is the mean of the racial wealth gap between white and Black households? And the fact that the magnitude of the wealth gap is that 13% of the population have only 3% of the wealth. And that 25% of whites have wealth in excess of 1 million versus only 4% of Black Americans. So he's actually done work over the decades on this front, and I do think that there's momentum that's been building, and individual companies have been coming forward as well as universities that have been apologizing for the use of enslaved persons, as well as making money through slavery. So I do think there's sufficient momentum at this stage, and it's a really, really important topic. I have a presentation on this, and I'm happy to send it to Nisa if anyone's interested, but I think Darity is a great resource.
I'd love to see that presentation too.
Yeah, Darity, I think, is like a great resource in terms of sort of, from an academic lens, at least, in terms of calculating out sort of the monetary reparations. But by no means is the monetary piece the only one. Others, like Ana Lucia Araujo, who's at Howard, has talked about this from a global perspective in terms of slavery across the Americas, and she looks also at the issues of like apologies or statements, if you will, as well as ways in which public spaces can be reclaimed to really emphasize not just people who are slave owners, like all of the statues now that are being, brought down across Barbados and different places in the UK as well. So, I think there's different people approaching this from different perspectives, but oftentimes I hear, oh, it's too expensive, or how would this work? But there's actually been a lot of work. It's similar to what you're doing, where what I've realized is in any of these fields, there's actually a lot of thoughtful work that's being put in by people on the ground. But then others who are skeptical or opposed are just not aware of all of the backstory, which actually brings me to a question that's been raised by Monica in the chat, which are, what are some practical ways of engaging people to participate in the democratic process and change perceptions or misperceptions of safety?
That's a really great question. I want to just add one quick thought also on this question of violence, which is just to lift up that in that Richmond, California example, there was a cycle of violence and poverty and incarceration that was systemic and had gone on for generations. And so Devon's work really was part of interrupting that cycle of violence and incarceration. And I think if those kinds of programs were funded in cities and towns across the country, there would be an interruption of violence. So one of the things I think is just to name the way in which incarceration has not resulted in reductions in violence, and to really reframe it in that way. I also really appreciate this question about participation. An event that we do every year, we call Night Out for Safety and Liberation. It's sort of a remix of an event called National Night Out. And National Night Out has a good sort of ethos behind it, in the sense of like it's neighbors coming out to reclaim community safety. But it's also and too often really been directed in a way where police are saying, you're the eyes and ears of the police, and if you see something, say something. And it has been unhelpful in that way. And we started Night Out for Safety and Liberation after George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman was a self-proclaimed neighborhood watch captain, and really wanted people to just engage and think about safety in a different way, that, we have more than eyes and ears. We have hearts, we have hands, we have minds. There's a lot of ways that people contribute to community safety, from mentoring a young person to offering a formerly incarcerated person a job. And the Night Out for Safety and Liberation gives folks an opportunity, and you can check it out at nosl.us, gives folks an opportunity to engage in their community, both with their neighbors, but also then to translate that into those meetings with the police department, into their dealings with city council members, to really begin to rebalance the budgets in the ways that I described. So I think that's one way that people can participate. Some amazing things happened on the ballot this year in California to restore the rights of formerly incarcerated folks to vote. Supporting those kinds of initiatives are super important as well. So those are a couple of things that come to mind.
Terrific. Before we wrap up and segue back to Wade, did you have any closing thoughts for us, Zach?
No, I think mostly I just want to appreciate the opportunity and appreciate the work of you all. I think it's super instrumental, incredibly important. And to have an organization of your stature really refocus on the United States, and to be in partnership with grassroots organizations across the country that are really moving this work is so incredibly important, because we wouldn't be able to have this high-level conversation about what safety is and how we truly get there if there weren't organizations really calling these questions, if there weren't folks in Chicago, as I saw mentioned in the chat, where people said, you know what, we need reparations given the actions of the Chicago Police Department, which for decades have been torturing Black men inside of jails in the city of Chicago. They were successful and able to organize and to say, not only are we going to have reparations for these victims, but we're going to include that story in the Chicago public school curriculum. And that kind of work that is on the ground, that is really calling our elected officials and to account and holding them accountable, is work that you all have been instrumental in moving forward and supporting. And so just really want to say thank you for that work.
Thank you so much. I'll turn it back to you now, Wade.
Hey everyone. So sorry, it's saying I'm unable to start my video. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much, Sushma. Thank you so much, Zach. Zach, especially for taking time out of your everyday work to come do this, and Sushma likewise at the Carr Center. We're so grateful. I think before we wrap up, if our staff, if our leadership council members, if our members of our board of directors want to continue to follow some of your work, where can they find you on social media? What are some platforms that you're using to talk about these important issues, to stay connected and to stay in tune with your work, your ideas, your leadership?
Do you want to get us started, Zach? Or?
Sure. You can check us out at ellabakercenter.org. That's ELLA bakercenter.org. You can also check out the work of Restore Oakland, where we're housed at restoreoakland.org. And we have a newly titled version of the paperback coming out in February 2021. So you can check that out at zachnorris.com. So thank you, Wade, and thank you, Sushma. It's been a really great opportunity to be a part of this conversation. And thank you, Carrie Kennedy, also as well, for your long-term support of the work of the Ella Baker Center.
So I am currently the executive director of the Carr Center. You can find us at carcenter.hks.harvard.edu. Sorry, it's a bit of full. If you're interested in the US, we actually do have a project called Reimagining Rights and Responsibilities in the United States, and Wade has been part of those consultations. We've actually come out with a very large report for the incoming administration on how to address the rollback of rights in a variety of areas: equal opportunity, due process, privacy. It's a range of issues. We have over 80 policy recommendations, but really the work is not done. I feel like now with the election, our work is like restarting, if you will. And it's really important for us to ensure that we keep supporting groups like RFK Human Rights, like the Ella Baker Center, to ensure that the work continues. There's going to be so many important priorities for the incoming administration that we have to keep our eye on the ball. I'm also on Twitter at Sushma Raman, although I'll just say a caveat, that's usually my personal late night musings. I write for Foreign Policy. If you go to the Foreign Policy website, you can search my name, and I write on an assortment of topics that catch my fancy, everything from freedom of the press and how it's under attack around the world, to how defunding the police might actually inadvertently end us up having us more surveilled thanks to technological advances that might be seeming more neutral, but are actually equally, if not more, biased by race. And then my most recent piece was on the incoming, the top policy priorities of the Biden administration, where I talk about sort of the domestic priorities around immigration and refugee policy that needs to be more just and humane, not just overturning, the past 4 years horror show. Reparations and racial equity and regulation of technology's role in society. So, and then I have a new book as well.
I was gonna say, Sushma. Yeah.
It's not so much focused on the U.S. per se. It's really global, but it does have sections on the U.S. It's called The Coming Good Society. There is a chapter on the right to privacy in an era of surveillance, but we also look at gene editing and autonomous weaponry and implications for rights, rights of nature, which is something I think in Latin America is widely understood. And my co-author on this is Bill Schultz, who I actually met through Carrie 14 years ago when we both joined the RFK judging panel for the Human Rights Award. and he was the former ED of Amnesty International. So yeah, so that's what I've been doing in my spare time.
In all of your spare time, right? I just bought the book, so I'm excited to check it out. Yeah.
Highly recommend it. Obviously, we already all have Zach's book, but we'll look for that paperback coming out in February. Good time to start giving it away to folks, and couldn't be more timely, Zach. I know you were kind of ahead of the curve in the national conversation, and just so grateful that you would take the time to come discuss these issues and unpack them even more for us and with us. And we look really forward to staying in contact and hopefully collaborating and conspiring together on those initiatives.
Absolutely.
To come. And so thank you so much, both of you. Thank you to our Leadership Council members, to our staff, to our board of directors who joined us today. And a huge thank you to Nisa, who made all of this possible. And